I think there are a couple of things that SPORTVU really did. One is it accelerated the movement from when we were showing up, like in 2010, when we were first talking to teams, 2009. I think I did the math, and I think half the teams had someone on their staff that was like a data analyst, but only half. Like half of them didn't have anybody, right? It was if someone was looking at statistics, it was like their side jobs. And all of them were doing what I would call spreadsheet analytics. So they're dealing with Excel. And so they were, dealing with play-by-play data. They're dealing with data they could dump into Excel, maybe run some macros, deal with that. And then we come along and say, here's a million records for one game. That's not Excel anymore, right? And so in those early days, what we accelerated was not only the adoption of analytics at each of these teams, but the building out of more than just having a guy. A lot of these teams now have a whole group, and they have programmers, and they have developers, and they have people that need to work in other coding languages. So that was the big difference, is they didn't know what to do with it, mainly because it was in a format they couldn't even deal with. So we would have to do that work for them and then dump it into Excel. And a lot of the initial conversations, it's funny you say that about Golden State and the passes, because as I explained it, one of the things the other thing that SPORTVU did was, if you think about the data that happens in a basketball game, like a timeline, like a book, you might have, before we came along, in the play-by-play, you would have a defensive rebound, and then 23 seconds later, you could have a missed shot. But nothing happened within that 23 seconds in that data. Now we're filling everything in. How many touches, how many dribbles, how many passes, the movement of all the players. Like, there's a lot that happens in that period of time that, until SPORTVU came along, didn't exist. So some teams did track how many times did we pass, but they would do that manually, and they would do that just for themselves. And they couldn't do that for every game and every situation against every team and all that kind of stuff. So what we were able to do is automate all that, and not only do that, but do that for every single game that happened. And so now you can, not, instead of worrying about tallying it and then having the human error part of it, but also have more context around it to know when we passed, how many times did we dribble before that pass? What was the situation we passed in? On the second or third pass, what happened? It'll add a lot more context. So in those early days, teams didn't know what to do with it. And so what we did is we had a lot of conversations with them. And one of the first things we did is we tried to take data they already were comfortable with and then add context to it. So the first thing we did is we came up with a couple of statistics. One was called a rebound chance. And we had to define that. We had to say, okay, you had 10 rebounds, but how many chances did you have at a rebound? How often were you in the proximity of a rebound? And how many times did you come away with it? And again, those are things that people just didn't know. They didn't track that. They didn't know how many times you could have had a rebound. On the passing side, in addition to the number of passes and stuff, we came up with what we called a potential assist. That was one that got a lot of people's attention, because first we had to define an assist. This is an interesting story, because the NBA's definition is a pass that leads to a basket. That's literally it, which leads to a lot of interpretation, which is why you've seen some of these studies that there were teams that, like the home team, when you play at home, you get more assists when you play on the road and stuff like that, because your guys were doing the statistics. So we ran a bunch of analysis, and we found that 96% of assists, you had the ball less than 3 seconds and you took less than 2 dribbles, something like that. And so we define an assist that way. And then we use that definition to say, how many times were you in that situation? And quite frankly, the guy just didn't make the basket. How many times did you make a great pass to a guy into the basket and he misses a layup? Well, that could have been an assist. You did all the right things. He just didn't make the basket. So now suddenly you can look at it and say, okay, you had 8 assists, but you had 7 potential assists. And so you're making the right passes. And I remember some teams were like, that's what we're looking for, because we want the guys that maybe aren't surrounded by the best shooters. And if we surround them by better players, instead of going 6 assists a game, they could get up to 10, because now guys are making those shots or whatever it is. So we tried to take data points that people were familiar with and just add more context to them. Sometimes people think about this stuff and say, oh, you created brand new statistics. I'm like, yeah, that came along. But the first thing was just adding more context to stuff you were already familiar with. Or even things like types of shots. So again, people always tracked a catch and shoot or a shot off the dribble, but that was all done manually, and it was all based on anybody's definition. Now through data, we can actually define it as a catch and shoot is you didn't take a dribble, and you had the ball for less than 2 seconds before you shot it. And so now we actually have a common definition, and we can, and the nice thing about having data is if you decide to tweak that definition, you can rerun it through all the data you have, and you can kind of change things as you go. So those early days were pretty interesting because we were doing a lot of experimentation. And what we would do is we would come up with stuff on our own, and then we'd show it to the teams and we'd get their feedback. And sometimes we'd change it based on their feedback. Other times they'd give us other ideas that we'd work on. So it was definitely, in those early days, they didn't have the staff to work with the data, so they relied on us and our team to do it for them.